Napoleon Bonaparte, later known by his regnal name Napoleon I, was a French military and political leader who rose to prominence during the French Revolution and led successful campaigns during the Revolutionary Wars. He was the de facto leader of the French Republic as first consul from 1799 to 1804, then Emperor of the French from 1804 until 1814 and again in 1815. He is considered one of the greatest military commanders in history. Napoleon's political and cultural legacy endures to this day. He stands as one of the most celebrated and controversial leaders in history. Napoleon was born on the island of Corsica, not long after its annexation by France, to a native family descending from minor Italian nobility. He supported the French Revolution in 1789 while serving in the French army, and tried to spread its ideals to his native Corsica. He rose rapidly in the army after he saved the governing French Directory by firing on royalist insurgents. In 1796, he began a military campaign against the Austrians and their Italian allies, scoring decisive victories and becoming a national hero. 2 years later, he led a military expedition to Egypt that served as a springboard to political power. He engineered a coup in November 1799 and became first consul of the Republic. Differences with the United Kingdom meant France faced the War of the Third Coalition by 1805. Napoleon shattered this coalition with victories in the Ulm campaign, and at the Battle of Austerlitz, which led to the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1806, the Fourth Coalition took up arms against him. Napoleon defeated Prussia at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, marched the Grande Army into Eastern Europe, and defeated the Russians in June 1807 at Friedland, forcing the defeated nations of the Fourth Coalition to accept the treaties of Tilsit. 2 years later, the Austrians challenged the French again during the War of the Fifth Coalition, but Napoleon solidified his grip over Europe after triumphing at the Battle of Wagram. Hoping to extend the continental system, his embargo against Britain, Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula and declared his brother Joseph the King of Spain in 1808. The Spanish and the Portuguese revolted in the Peninsular War, culminating in defeat for Napoleon's marshals. Napoleon launched an invasion of Russia in the summer of 1812. The resulting campaign witnessed the catastrophic retreat of Napoleon's Grande Army. In 1813, Prussia and Austria joined Russian forces in a sixth coalition against France, resulting in a large coalition army defeating Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig. The coalition invaded France and captured Paris, forcing Napoleon to abdicate in April 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba, between Corsica and Italy. In France, the Bourbons were restored to power. However, Napoleon escaped in February 1815 and took control of France. The Allies responded by forming a seventh coalition, which defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. The British exiled him to the remote island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, where he died in 1821 at the age of 51. Napoleon had an extensive impact on the modern world, bringing liberal reforms to the countries he conquered, especially the regions of the Low Countries, Switzerland, and parts of modern Italy and Germany. He implemented many liberal policies in France and Western Europe. Early life. Napoleon's family was of Italian origin. His paternal ancestors, the Bonapartes, descended from a minor Tuscan noble family who emigrated to Corsica in the 16th century, and his maternal ancestors, the Remolinos, descended from a minor Genoese noble family. The Bonapartes were also the relatives, by marriage and by birth, of the Pietracentas, Costas, Paravicinis, and Bonellis, all Corsican families of the interior. His parents Carlo Maria de Buonaparte and Maria Letizia Remolino maintained an ancestral home called Casa Buonaparte in Ajaccio. It was there, at this home, that Napoleon was born, on August 15, 1769. He was the fourth child and third son of the family. He had an elder brother, Joseph, and younger siblings Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, Caroline, and Jerome. Napoleon was baptized as a Catholic, under the name Napoleon. In his youth, his name was also spelled as Napoleon, Nabulio, Napoleon, and Napoleoni. Napoleon was born in the same year that the Republic of Genoa ceded the region of Corsica to France. The state sold sovereign rights a year before his birth, and the island was conquered by France during the year of his birth. It was formally incorporated as a province in 1770, after 500 years under Genoese rule and 14 years of independence. Napoleon's parents joined the Corsican resistance and fought against the French to maintain independence, even when Maria was pregnant with him. His father Carlo was an attorney who had supported and actively collaborated with patriot Pascal Paoli during the Corsican War of Independence against France. After the Corsican defeat at Ponte Novo in 1769 and Paoli's exile in Britain, Carlo began working for the new French government and went on to be named representative of the island to the court of Louis XVI in 1777. The dominant influence of Napoleon's childhood was his mother, whose firm discipline restrained a rambunctious child. Later in life, Napoleon stated, "The future destiny of the child is always the work of the mother." Napoleon's maternal grandmother had married into the Swiss Fesch family in her second marriage, and Napoleon's uncle, the Cardinal Joseph Fesch, would fulfill a role as protector of the Bonaparte family for some years. Napoleon's noble, moderately affluent background afforded him greater opportunities to study than were available to a typical Corsican of the time. When he turned 9 years old, he moved to the French mainland and enrolled at a religious school in Autun in January 1779. In May, he transferred with a scholarship to a military academy at Brienne-le-Château. In his youth he was an outspoken Corsican nationalist and supported the state's independence from France. Like many Corsicans, Napoleon spoke and read Corsican and Italian. He began learning French in school at around age 10. Although he became fluent in French, he spoke with a distinctive Corsican accent and never learned how to spell correctly in French. Consequently, Napoleon was treated unfairly by his schoolmates. He was, however, not an isolated case, as it was estimated in 1790 that fewer than 3 million people, out of France's population of 28 million, were able to speak standard French, and those who could write it were even fewer. Napoleon was routinely bullied by his peers for his accent, birthplace, short stature, mannerisms, and inability to speak French quickly. He became reserved and melancholy, applying himself to reading. An examiner observed that Napoleon has always been distinguished for his application in mathematics. He is fairly well acquainted with history and geography. This boy would make an excellent sailor. One story told of Napoleon at the school is that he led junior students to victory against senior students in a snowball fight, showing his leadership abilities. In early adulthood, Napoleon briefly intended to become a writer. He authored a history of Corsica and a romantic novella. On completion of his studies at Brienne in 1784, Napoleon was admitted to the École Militaire in Paris. He trained to become an artillery officer and, when his father's death reduced his income, was forced to complete the 2-year course in 1 year. He was the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire. He was examined by the famed scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace. Early career. Upon graduating in September 1785, Bonaparte was commissioned as second lieutenant in La Fère Artillery Regiment. He served in Valence and Oxenay until after the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. The young man still was a fervent Corsican nationalist during this period and asked for leave to join his mentor Pascal Paoli, when the latter was allowed to return to Corsica by the National Assembly. Paoli had no sympathy for Napoleon, however, as he deemed his father a traitor for having deserted his cause for Corsican independence. He spent the early years of the revolution in Corsica, fighting in a complex three-way struggle among royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican nationalists. Napoleon, however, came to embrace the ideals of the revolution, becoming a supporter of the Jacobins and joining the pro-French Corsican Republicans who opposed Paoli's policy and his aspirations of secession. He was given command over a battalion of volunteers and was promoted to captain in the regular army in July 1792, despite exceeding his leave of absence and leading a riot against French troops. When Corsica declared formal secession from France and requested the protection of the British government, Napoleon and his commitment to the French Revolution came into conflict with Paoli, who had decided to sabotage the Corsican contribution to the Expedition de Sardaigne, by preventing a French assault on the Sardinian island of La Maddalena. Bonaparte and his family were compelled to flee to Toulon on the French mainland in June 1793 because of the split with Paoli. Although he was born Napoleon Bonaparte, it was after this that Napoleon began styling himself Napoleon Bonaparte, but his family did not drop the name Bonaparte until 1796. The first known record of him signing his name as Bonaparte was at the age of 27. Siege of Toulon. In July 1793, Bonaparte published a pro-republican pamphlet entitled Le Super de Beaucaire, which gained him the support of Augustin Robespierre, younger brother of the revolutionary leader Maximilien Robespierre. With the help of his fellow Corsican Antoine Christophe Salicetti, Bonaparte was appointed senior gunner and artillery commander of the Republican forces, which arrived on September 8 at Toulon. He adopted a plan to capture a hill where Republican guns could dominate the city's harbor and force the British to evacuate. The assault on the position led to the capture of the city, but during it Bonaparte was wounded in the thigh on December 16. Catching the attention of the Committee of Public Safety, he was put in charge of the artillery of France's Army of Italy. On December 22 he was on his way to his new post in Nice, promoted from the rank of colonel to brigadier general at the age of 24. He devised plans for attacking the Kingdom of Sardinia as part of France's campaign against the First Coalition. The French army carried out Bonaparte's plan in the Battle of Saorgio in April 1794, and then advanced to seize Ormia in the mountains. From Ormia, they headed west to outflank the Austro-Sardinian positions around Saorge. After this campaign, Augustin Robespierre sent Bonaparte on a mission to the Republic of Genoa to determine that country's intentions towards France. 13 Vendémiaire. Some contemporaries alleged that Bonaparte was put under house arrest at Nice for his association with the Robespierres following their fall in the Thermidorian reaction in July 1794, but Napoleon's secretary Bourrienne disputed the allegation in his memoirs. According to Bourrienne, jealousy was responsible, between the Army of the Alps and the Army of Italy. Bonaparte dispatched an impassioned defense in a letter to the Commissar Salicetti, and he was subsequently acquitted of any wrongdoing. He was released within 2 weeks and, due to his technical skills, was asked to draw up plans to attack Italian positions in the context of France's war with Austria. He also took part in an expedition to take back Corsica from the British, but the French were repulsed by the British Royal Navy. By 1795, Bonaparte had become engaged to Désirée Clary, daughter of François Clary. Désirée's sister Julie Clary had married Bonaparte's elder brother Joseph. In April 1795, he was assigned to the Army of the West, which was engaged in the war in the Vendée, a civil war and royalist counter-revolution in Vendée, a region in west-central France on the Atlantic Ocean. As an infantry command, it was a demotion from artillery general for which the army already had a full quota, and he pleaded poor health to avoid the posting. He was moved to the Bureau of Topography of the Committee of Public Safety and sought unsuccessfully to be transferred to Constantinople in order to offer his services to the Sultan. During this period, he wrote the romantic novella Clisson et Eugenie, about a soldier and his lover, in a clear parallel to Bonaparte's own relationship with Désirée. On September 15, Bonaparte was removed from the list of generals in regular service for his refusal to serve in the Vendée campaign. He faced a difficult financial situation and reduced career prospects. On October 3, Royalists in Paris declared a rebellion against the National Convention. Paul Barras, a leader of the Thermidorian reaction, knew of Bonaparte's military exploits at Toulon and gave him command of the improvised forces in defense of the convention in the Tuileries Palace. Napoleon had seen the massacre of the King's Swiss Guard there 3 years earlier and realized that artillery would be the key to its defense. He ordered a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat to seize large cannons and used them to repel the attackers. On October 5, 1795, 13 Vendémiaire and 4 in the French Republican calendar, 1,400 royalists died and the rest fled. He had cleared the streets with a whiff of grapeshot, according to 19th-century historian Thomas Carlyle in The French Revolution, A History. The defeat of the royalist insurrection extinguished the threat to the convention and earned Bonaparte sudden fame, wealth, and the patronage of the new government, the Directory. Murat married one of Napoleon's sisters, becoming his brother-in-law. He also served under Napoleon as one of his generals. Bonaparte was promoted to commander of the interior and given command of the Army of Italy. Within weeks, he was romantically involved with Josephine de Beauharnais, the former mistress of Barras. The couple married on March 9, 1796 in a civil ceremony. First Italian campaign. 2 days after the marriage, Bonaparte left Paris to take command of the Army of Italy. He immediately went on the offensive, hoping to defeat the forces of Piedmont before their Austrian allies could intervene. In a series of rapid victories during the Montenotte campaign, he knocked Piedmont out of the war in 2 weeks. The French then focused on the Austrians for the remainder of the war, the highlight of which became the protracted struggle for Mantua. The Austrians launched a series of offensives against the French to break the siege, but Napoleon defeated every relief effort, scoring victories at the battles of Castiglione, Bassano, Arcole, and Rivoli. The decisive French triumph at Rivoli in January 1797 led to the collapse of the Austrian position in Italy. At Rivoli, the Austrians lost up to 14,000 men while the French lost about 5,000. The next phase of the campaign featured the French invasion of the Habsburg heartlands. French forces in southern Germany had been defeated by the Archduke Charles in 1796, but the Archduke withdrew his forces to protect Vienna after learning about Napoleon's assault. In the first encounter between the two commanders, Napoleon pushed back his opponent and advanced deep into Austrian territory after winning at the Battle of Tarvis in March 1797. The Austrians were alarmed by the French thrust that reached all the way to Leoben, about 100 kilometers from Vienna, and finally decided to sue for peace. The Treaty of Leoben, followed by the more comprehensive Treaty of Campo Formio, gave France control of most of northern Italy and the Low Countries, and a secret clause promised the Republic of Venice to Austria. Bonaparte marched on Venice and forced its surrender, ending 1,100 years of Venetian independence. He also authorized the French to loot treasures such as the horses of Saint Mark. On the journey, Bonaparte conversed much about the warriors of antiquity, especially Alexander, Caesar, Scipio and Hannibal. He studied their strategy and combined it with his own. In a question from Bourrienne, asking whether he gave his preference to Alexander or Caesar, Napoleon said that he places Alexander the Great in the first rank, the main reason being his campaign on Asia. His application of conventional military ideas to real-world situations enabled his military triumphs, such as creative use of artillery as a mobile force to support his infantry. He stated later in life, "I have fought 60 battles and I have learned nothing which I did not know at the beginning." Look at Caesar, he fought the first like the last. Bonaparte could win battles by concealment of troop deployments and concentration of his forces on the hinge of an enemy's weakened front. If he could not use his favorite envelopment strategy, he would take up the central position and attack two co-operating forces at their hinge, swing round to fight one until it fled, then turn to face the other. In this Italian campaign, Bonaparte's army captured 150,000 prisoners, 540 cannons, and 170 standards. The French army fought 67 actions and won 18 pitched battles through superior artillery technology and Bonaparte's tactics. During the campaign, Bonaparte became increasingly influential in French politics. He founded two newspapers, one for the troops in his army and another for circulation in France. The Royalists attacked Bonaparte for looting Italy and warned that he might become a dictator. Napoleon's forces extracted an estimated $45 million in funds from Italy during their campaign there, another $12 million in precious metals and jewels. His forces also confiscated more than 300 priceless paintings and sculptures. Bonaparte sent General Pierre Augereau to Paris to lead a coup d'état and purge the Royalists on 4 September coup of 18 Fructidor. This left Barras and his Republican allies in control again but dependent on Bonaparte, who proceeded to peace negotiations with Austria. These negotiations resulted in the Treaty of Campo Formio, and Bonaparte returned to Paris in December as a hero. He met Talleyrand, France's new foreign minister who served in the same capacity for Emperor Napoleon, and they began to prepare for an invasion of Britain. Egyptian expedition. After 2 months of planning, Bonaparte decided that France's naval strength was not yet sufficient to confront the British Royal Navy. He decided on a military expedition to seize Egypt and thereby undermine Britain's access to its trade interests in India. Bonaparte wished to establish a French presence in the Middle East and join forces with Tipu Sultan, the Sultan of Mysore, who was an enemy of the British. Napoleon assured the Directory that as soon as he had conquered Egypt, he will establish relations with the Indian princes and, together with them, attack the English in their possessions. The Directory agreed in order to secure a trade route to the Indian subcontinent. In May 1798, Bonaparte was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. His Egyptian expedition included a group of 167 scientists, with mathematicians, naturalists, chemists, and geodesists among them. Their discoveries included the Rosetta Stone, and their work was published in the Description de l'Egypte in 1809. En route to Egypt, Bonaparte reached Malta on June 9, 1798, then controlled by the Knights Hospitaller. Grand Master Ferdinand von Hompesch Balheim surrendered after token resistance, and Bonaparte captured an important naval base with the loss of only 3 men. Bonaparte and his expedition eluded pursuit by the Royal Navy and landed at Alexandria on July 1. He fought the Battle of Shubrakit against the Mamluks, Egypt's ruling military caste. This helped the French practice their defensive tactic for the Battle of the Pyramids, fought on July 21, about 24 kilometers from the pyramids. General Bonaparte's forces of 25,000 roughly equaled those of the Mamluks' Egyptian cavalry. 29 French and approximately 2,000 Egyptians were killed. The victory boosted the morale of the French army. On August 1, 1798, the British fleet under Sir Horatio Nelson captured or destroyed all but 2 vessels of the French fleet in the Battle of the Nile, defeating Bonaparte's goal to strengthen the French position in the Mediterranean. His army had succeeded in a temporary increase of French power in Egypt, though it faced repeated uprisings. In early 1799, he moved an army into the Ottoman province of Damascus. Bonaparte led these 13,000 French soldiers in the conquest of the coastal towns of Arish, Gaza, Jaffa, and Haifa. The attack on Jaffa was particularly brutal. Bonaparte discovered that many of the defenders were former prisoners of war, ostensibly on parole, so he ordered the garrison and 1,400 prisoners to be executed by bayonet or drowning to save bullets. Men, women, and children were robbed and murdered for 3 days. Bonaparte began with an army of 13,000 men, 1,500 were reported missing, 1,200 died in combat, and thousands perished from disease, mostly bubonic plague. He failed to reduce the fortress of Acre, so he marched his army back to Egypt in May. To speed up the retreat, Bonaparte ordered plague-stricken men to be poisoned with opium. The number who died remains disputed, ranging from a low of 30 to a high of 580. He also brought out 1,000 wounded men. Back in Egypt on July 25, Bonaparte defeated an Ottoman amphibious invasion at Aboukir, ruler of France. While in Egypt, Bonaparte stayed informed of European affairs. He learned that France had suffered a series of defeats in the War of the Second Coalition. On August 24, 1799, he took advantage of the temporary departure of British ships from French coastal ports and set sail for France, despite the fact that he had received no explicit orders from Paris. The army was left in the charge of Jean-Baptiste Kleber. Unknown to Bonaparte, the Directory had sent him orders to return to ward off possible invasions of French soil, but poor lines of communication prevented the delivery of these messages. By the time that he reached Paris in October, France's situation had been improved by a series of victories. The Republic, however, was bankrupt and the ineffective Directory was unpopular with the French population. The Directory discussed Bonaparte's desertion but was too weak to punish him. Despite the failures in Egypt, Napoleon returned to a hero's welcome. He drew together an alliance with Director Emmanuel Joseph Sieyes, his brother Lucien, Speaker of the Council of 500 Roger Ducasse, Director Joseph Fouché, and Talleyrand, and they overthrew the Directory by a coup d'état on November 9, 1799, closing down the Council of 500. Napoleon became first consul for 10 years, with 2 consuls appointed by him who had consultative voices only. His power was confirmed by the new constitution of the year 8, originally devised by Sieyes to give Napoleon a minor role, but rewritten by Napoleon, and accepted by direct popular vote. The constitution preserved the appearance of a republic but, in reality, established a dictatorship. French consulate. Napoleon established a political system that historian Martin Lyons called dictatorship by plebiscite. Worried by the democratic forces unleashed by the revolution, but unwilling to ignore them entirely, Napoleon resorted to regular electoral consultations with the French people on his road to imperial power. He drafted the Constitution of the year 8 and secured his own election as first consul, taking up residence at the Tuileries. The Constitution was approved in a rigged plebiscite held the following January, with 99.94% officially listed as voting yes. Napoleon's brother, Lucien, had falsified the returns to show that 3 million people had participated in the plebiscite. The real number was 1.5 million. Political observers at the time assumed the eligible French voting public numbered about 5 million people, so the regime artificially doubled the participation rate to indicate popular enthusiasm for the consulate. In the first few months of the consulate, with war in Europe still raging and internal instability still plaguing the country, Napoleon's grip on power remained very tenuous. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon and his troops crossed the Swiss Alps into Italy, aiming to surprise the Austrian armies that had reoccupied the peninsula when Napoleon was still in Egypt. After a difficult crossing over the Alps, the French army entered the plains of northern Italy virtually unopposed. While one French army approached from the north, the Austrians were busy with another stationed in Genoa, which was besieged by a substantial force. The fierce resistance of this French army, under André Massena, gave the northern force some time to carry out their operations with little interference. After spending several days looking for each other, the two armies collided at the Battle of Marengo on June 14. General Melas had a numerical advantage, fielding about 30,000 Austrian soldiers while Napoleon commanded 24,000 French troops. The battle began favorably for the Austrians as their initial attack surprised the French and gradually drove them back. Melas stated that he had won the battle and retired to his headquarters around 3 p.m., leaving his subordinates in charge of pursuing the French. The French lines never broke during their tactical retreat. Napoleon constantly rode out among the troops urging them to stand and fight. Late in the afternoon, a full division under Desaix arrived on the field and reversed the tide of the battle. A series of artillery barrages and cavalry charges decimated the Austrian army, which fled over the Bormida River back to Alessandria, leaving behind 14,000 casualties. The following day, the Austrian army agreed to abandon northern Italy once more with the Convention of Alessandria, which granted them safe passage to friendly soil in exchange for their fortresses throughout the region. Although critics have blamed Napoleon for several tactical mistakes preceding the battle, they have also praised his audacity for selecting a risky campaign strategy, choosing to invade the Italian peninsula from the north when the vast majority of French invasions came from the west, near or along the coastline. As David G. Chandler points out, Napoleon spent almost a year getting the Austrians out of Italy in his first campaign. In 1800, it took him only a month to achieve the same goal. German strategist and Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen concluded that Bonaparte did not annihilate his enemy but eliminated him and rendered him harmless while attaining the object of the campaign, the conquest of North Italy. Napoleon's triumph at Marengo secured his political authority and boosted his popularity back home, but it did not lead to an immediate peace. Bonaparte's brother, Joseph, led the complex negotiations in Luneville and reported that Austria, emboldened by British support, would not acknowledge the new territory that France had acquired. As negotiations became increasingly fractious, Bonaparte gave orders to his general Moreau to strike Austria once more. Moreau and the French swept through Bavaria and scored an overwhelming victory at Hohenlinden in December 1800. As a result, the Austrians capitulated and signed the Treaty of Luneville in February 1801. The treaty reaffirmed and expanded earlier French gains at Campo Formio. Temporary peace in Europe. French Empire. During the Consulate, Napoleon faced several royalist and Jacobin assassination plots, including the Conspiration des Poignards in October 1800 and the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise 2 months later. In January 1804, his police uncovered an assassination plot against him that involved Moreau and which was ostensibly sponsored by the Bourbon family, the former rulers of France. On the advice of Talleyrand, Napoleon ordered the kidnapping of the Duke of Enghien, violating the sovereignty of Baden. The Duke was quickly executed after a secret military trial, even though he had not been involved in the plot. Enghien execution infuriated royal courts throughout Europe, becoming one of the contributing political factors for the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars. To expand his power, Napoleon used these assassination plots to justify the creation of an imperial system based on the Roman model. He believed that a Bourbon restoration would be more difficult if his family's succession was entrenched in the constitution. Launching yet another referendum, Napoleon was elected as Emperor of the French by a tally exceeding 99%. As with the Life Consulate 2 years earlier, this referendum produced heavy participation, bringing out almost 3.6 million voters to the polls. A keen observer of Bonaparte's rise to absolute power, Madame de Remusat, explains that men worn out by the turmoil of the revolution looked for the domination of an able ruler and that people believed quite sincerely that Bonaparte, whether as consul or emperor, would exert his authority and save from the perils of anarchy. Napoleon's coronation, at which Pope Pius VII officiated, took place at Notre Dame de Paris, on December 2, 1804. 2 separate crowns were brought for the ceremony, a golden laurel wreath recalling the Roman Empire, and a replica of Charlemagne's crown. Napoleon entered the ceremony wearing the laurel wreath and kept it on his head throughout the proceedings. For the official coronation, he raised the Charlemagne crown over his own head in a symbolic gesture, but never placed it on top because he was already wearing the golden wreath. Instead he placed the crown on Josephine's head, the event commemorated in the officially sanctioned painting by Jacques-Louis David. Napoleon was also crowned King of Italy, with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, at the Cathedral of Milan on May 26, 1805. He created 18 marshals of the empire from among his top generals to secure the allegiance of the army on May 18, 1804, the official start of the empire. War of the Third Coalition. Middle Eastern alliances. War of the Fourth Coalition and Tilsit. Peninsular War and Erfurt. War of the Fifth Coalition and Marie-Louise. Invasion of Russia. War of the Sixth Coalition. Exile to Elba. 100 Days. Exile on St. Helena. The British kept Napoleon on the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, 1,870 kilometers from the west coast of Africa. They also took the precaution of sending a small garrison of soldiers to both St. Helena and the uninhabited Ascension Island, which lay between St. Helena and Europe, to prevent any escape from the island. Napoleon was moved to Longwood House on St. Helena in December 1815, it had fallen into disrepair, and the location was damp, windswept and unhealthy. The Times published articles insinuating the British government was trying to hasten his death. Napoleon often complained of the living conditions of Longwood House in letters to the island's governor and his custodian, Hudson Lowe, while his attendants complained of colds, catarrhs, damp floors, and poor provisions. Modern scientists have speculated that his later illness may have arisen from arsenic poisoning caused by copper arsenite in the wallpaper at Longwood House. With a small cadre of followers, Napoleon dictated his memoirs and grumbled about the living conditions. Lowe cut Napoleon's expenditure, ruled that no gifts were allowed if they mentioned his imperial status, and made his supporters sign a guarantee they would stay with the prisoner indefinitely. When he held a dinner party, men were expected to wear military dress and women in evening gowns and gems. It was an explicit denial of the circumstances of his captivity. While in exile, Napoleon wrote a book about Julius Caesar, one of his great heroes. He also studied English under the tutelage of Count Emmanuel de Las Cases with the main aim of being able to read English newspapers and books, as access to French newspapers and books was heavily restricted to him on St. Helena. Napoleon also devoted himself to compiling a book, Mémorial de St. Helene, an account which reflected his self-depiction as a liberal, visionary ruler for European unification, deposed by reactionary elements of the Ancien Regime. Another pastime of Napoleon's while in exile was playing card games. The number of patiences named in his honor seems to suggest that he was an avid player of the solitary game. Napoleon at St. Helena is described as being a favorite of his, while Napoleon's favorite is clearly a contender. Other games with a Napoleonic theme include Napoleon's Flank, Napoleon's Shoulder, Napoleon's Square and Little Napoleon Patience. However, Arnold argues that, while Napoleon played cards in exile, the notion that he played numerous patience games is based on a misunderstanding. There were rumors of plots and even of his escape from St. Helena, but in reality, no serious attempts were ever made. For English poet Lord Byron, Napoleon was the epitome of the romantic hero, the persecuted, lonely, and flawed genius. Death. Napoleon's personal physician, Barry O'Meara, warned London that his declining state of health was mainly caused by the harsh treatment. During the last few years of his life, Napoleon confined himself for months on end in his damp, mold-infested and wretched habitation of Longwood. Years of isolation and loneliness started taking its toll, and Napoleon began displaying serious symptoms of depression. In February 1821, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate rapidly, and he reconciled with the Catholic Church. By March, he had become confined to bed. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821 at Longwood House at age 51, after making his last confession, extreme unction, and viaticum in the presence of Father Angevinali from his deathbed. His last words were, France, l'armée, tête d'armée, Josephine. Shortly after his death, an autopsy was conducted, and Francesco Antimarchi, the doctor conducting the autopsy, cut off Napoleon's penis. Napoleon's original death mask was created around May 6, although it is not clear which doctor created it. Napoleon's heart and intestines were removed and contained separately in 2 sealed vessels, which were placed inside his coffin at his feet. In his will, he had asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, but the British governor said he should be buried on St. Helena, in the Valley of the Willows. In 1840, Louis Philippe I obtained permission from the British government to return Napoleon's remains to France. His casket was opened to confirm that it still contained the former emperor. Despite being dead for nearly 2 decades, Napoleon had been very well preserved and not decomposed at all. On December 15, 1840, a state funeral was held. The horse-drawn hearse proceeded from the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées, across the Place de la Concorde to the Esplanade des Invalides, and then to the cupola in St. Jerome's Chapel, where it remained until the tomb designed by Louis Visconti was completed. In 1861, Napoleon's remains were entombed in a sarcophagus of red quartzite from Russia in the crypt under the dome at Les Invalides. Cause of death: religion. Napoleon was baptized in Ajaccio on July 21, 1771. He was raised as a Catholic but never developed much faith, though he recalled the day of his first communion in the Catholic Church to be the happiest day of his life. As an adult, Napoleon was a deist, believing in an absent and distant God. However, he had a keen appreciation of the power of organized religion in social and political affairs, and he paid a great deal of attention to bending it to his purposes. He noted the influence of Catholicism's rituals and splendors. Napoleon had a civil marriage with Josephine de Beauharnais, without religious ceremony. Napoleon was crowned emperor on December 2, 1804 at Notre Dame de Paris in a ceremony presided over by Pope Pius VII. On the eve of the coronation ceremony, and at the insistence of Pope Pius VII, a private religious wedding ceremony of Napoleon and Josephine was celebrated. Cardinal Fesch performed the wedding. This marriage was annulled by tribunals under Napoleon's control in January 1810. On April 1, 1810, Napoleon married the Austrian Princess Marie-Louise in a Catholic ceremony. Napoleon was excommunicated by the Pope through the bull Quum Memoranda in 1809, but later reconciled with the Catholic Church before his death in 1821. While in exile in St. Helena, he is recorded to have said, "I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ is not a man." He also defended Muhammad against Voltaire's Mahomet. Concordat. Seeking national reconciliation between revolutionaries and Catholics, Napoleon and Pope Pius VII signed the Concordat of 1801 on July 15, 1801. It solidified the Roman Catholic Church as the majority church of France and brought back most of its civil status. The hostility of devout Catholics against the state had now largely been resolved. The Concordat did not restore the vast church lands and endowments that had been seized during the Revolution and sold off. As a part of the Concordat, Napoleon presented another set of laws called the Organic Articles. While the Concordat restored much power to the papacy, the balance of church-state relations had tilted firmly in Napoleon's favor. He selected the bishops and supervised church finances. Napoleon and the Pope both found the Concordat useful. Similar arrangements were made with the Church in territories controlled by Napoleon, especially Italy and Germany. Now, Napoleon could win favor with the Catholics while also controlling Rome in a political sense. Napoleon said in April 1801, "Skillful conquerors have not got entangled with priests. They can both contain them and use them." French children were issued a catechism that taught them to love and respect Napoleon. Arrest of Pope Pius VII. In 1809, under Napoleon's orders, Pope Pius VII was placed under arrest in Italy, and in 1812 the prisoner pontiff was transferred to France, being held in the Palace of Fontainebleau. Because the arrest was made in a clandestine manner, some sources describe it as a kidnapping. In January 1813, Napoleon personally forced the Pope to sign a humiliating Concordat of Fontainebleau, which was later repudiated by the pontiff. The Pope was not released until 1814, when the coalition invaded France. Religious emancipation. Napoleon emancipated Jews, as well as Protestants in Catholic countries and Catholics in Protestant countries, from laws which restricted them to ghettos, and he expanded their rights to property, worship, and careers. Despite the anti-Semitic reaction to Napoleon's policies from foreign governments and within France, he believed emancipation would benefit France by attracting Jews to the country given the restrictions they faced elsewhere. In 1806 an assembly of Jewish notables was gathered by Napoleon to discuss 12 questions broadly dealing with the relations between Jews and Christians, as well as other issues dealing with the Jewish ability to integrate into French society. Later, after the questions were answered in a satisfactory way according to the emperor, a great Sanhedrin was brought together to transform the answers into decisions that would form the basis of the future status of the Jews in France and the rest of the empire Napoleon was building. He stated, "I will never accept any proposals that will obligate the Jewish people to leave France, because to me the Jews are the same as any other citizen in our country. It takes weakness to chase them out of the country, but it takes strength to assimilate them." He was seen as so favorable to the Jews that the Russian Orthodox Church formally condemned him as Antichrist and the enemy of God. 1 year after the final meeting of the Sanhedrin, on March 17, 1808, Napoleon placed the Jews on probation. Several new laws restricting the citizenship the Jews had been offered 17 years previously were instituted at that time. However, despite pressure from leaders of a number of Christian communities to refrain from granting Jews emancipation, within 1 year of the issue of the new restrictions, they were once again lifted in response to the appeal of Jews from all over France. Freemasonry. It is not known for certain if Napoleon was initiated into Freemasonry. As emperor, he appointed his brothers to Masonic offices under his jurisdiction. Louis was given the title of Deputy Grand Master in 1805, Jerome the title of Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Westphalia, Joseph was appointed Grand Master of the Grand Orient de France, and finally Lucien was a member of the Grand Orient of France. Personality. Historians emphasize the strength of the ambition that took Napoleon from an obscure village to rule over most of Europe. In-depth academic studies about his early life conclude that up until age 2, he had a gentle disposition. His older brother, Joseph, frequently received their mother's attention, which made Napoleon more assertive and approval-driven. During his early schooling years, he would be harshly bullied by classmates for his Corsican identity and limited command of the French language. To withstand the stress he became domineering, eventually developing an inferiority complex. George F. Root stresses his rare combination of will, intellect and physical vigor. In one-on-one situations he typically had a hypnotic effect on people, seemingly bending the strongest leaders to his will. He understood military technology, but was not an innovator in that regard. He was an innovator in using the financial, bureaucratic, and diplomatic resources of France. He could rapidly dictate a series of complex commands to his subordinates, keeping in mind where major units were expected to be at each future point, and like a chess master, seeing the best plays moves ahead. This intellectual vigor was accompanied by a mixture of remarkable charisma and willpower and a furious temper exhibited during failure of his plans, which commanded respect as well as dread from his adjutants. Napoleon maintained strict, efficient work habits, prioritizing what needed to be done. He cheated at cards, but repaid the losses. He had to win at everything he attempted. He kept relays of staff and secretaries at work. Unlike many generals, Napoleon did not examine history to ask what Hannibal or Alexander or anyone else did in a similar situation. Critics said he won many battles simply because of luck. Napoleon responded, "Give me lucky generals," arguing that luck comes to leaders who recognize opportunity, and seize it. Dwyer states that Napoleon's victories at Austerlitz and Jena in 1805–06 heightened his sense of self-grandiosity, leaving him even more certain of his destiny and invincibility. "I am of the race that founds empires," he once boasted, deeming himself an heir to the ancient Romans. In terms of influence on events, it was more than Napoleon's personality that took effect. He reorganized France itself to supply the men and money needed for wars. He inspired his men. The Duke of Wellington said his presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 soldiers, for he inspired confidence from privates to field marshals. The force of his personality neutralized material difficulties as his soldiers fought with the confidence that with Napoleon in charge they would surely win. Image. The military historian Martin van Creveld has described him as the most competent human being who ever lived. Since his death, many towns, streets, ships, and even cartoon characters have been named after him. He has been portrayed in hundreds of films and discussed in hundreds of thousands of books and articles. The German legal scholar Karl Theodor Welcker described Napoleon as the greatest master of Machiavellism. When his contemporaries met him in person, many were surprised by his apparently unremarkable physical appearance in contrast to his significant deeds and reputation, especially in his youth, when he was consistently described as small and thin. English painter Joseph Farington, who observed Napoleon personally in 1802, commented that Samuel Rogers stood a little way from me and seemed to be disappointed in the look of countenance and said it was that of a little Italian. Farington said Napoleon's eyes were a lighter, and more of a grey, than I should have expected from his complexion, that his person is below middle size, and that his general aspect was milder than I had before thought it. A personal friend of Napoleon said that when he first met him in Brienne-le-Château as a young man, Napoleon was only notable for the dark color of his complexion, for his piercing and scrutinizing glance, and for the style of his conversation. He also said that Napoleon was personally a serious and somber man, his conversation bore the appearance of ill humor, and he was certainly not very amiable. Johann Ludwig Wurtemberger, who accompanied Napoleon from Camp Fourneau in 1797 and on the Swiss campaign of 1798, noted that Bonaparte was rather slight and emaciated-looking. His face, too, was very thin, with a dark complexion. His black, unpowdered hair hung down evenly over both shoulders, but that, despite his slight and unkempt appearance, his looks and expression were earnest and powerful. Denis Davidoff met him personally and considered him remarkably average in appearance. His face was slightly swarthy, with regular features. His nose was not very large, but straight, with a slight, hardly noticeable bend. The hair on his head was dark reddish blonde, his eyebrows and eyelashes were much darker than the color of his hair, and his blue eyes, set off by the almost black lashes, gave him a most pleasing expression. The man I saw was of short stature, just over 5 feet tall, rather heavy although he was only 37 years old. During the Napoleonic Wars, he was taken seriously by the British press as a dangerous tyrant, poised to invade. Despite or due to his average size, Napoleon was mocked in British newspapers as a short-tempered small man, and he was nicknamed Little Boney in a strong fit. A nursery rhyme warned children that Bonaparte ravenously ate naughty people, the bogeyman. The British propaganda about his supposedly small size was so successful that many people today know very little besides this untruth about him. At 1.57 meters, he had the height of an average French male but was short for an aristocrat or officer. Some historians believe his size at death was incorrectly recorded due to use of an obsolete old French yardstick. But Napoleon was a champion of the metric system and had no use for the old yardsticks that had been out of use since 1793 in France. It is likely that he was 1.57 m, the height measured on St. Helena, since he would have most likely been measured with an English yardstick rather than a yardstick of the French old regime. Napoleon surrounded himself with tall bodyguards and was affectionately nicknamed Le Petit Caporal, reflecting his reported camaraderie with his soldiers rather than his height. When he became first consul and later emperor, Napoleon eschewed his general's uniform and habitually wore the green colonel uniform of a colonel of the Chasseurs à Cheval of the Imperial Guard, the regiment that served as his personal escort many times, with a large bicorn. He also habitually wore the blue uniform of a colonel of the Imperial Guard Foot Grenadiers. He also wore his Légion d'honneur star, medal, and ribbon, and the Order of the Iron Crown decorations, white French-style culottes and white stockings. This was in contrast to the complex uniforms with many decorations of his marshals and those around him. In his later years he gained quite a bit of weight and had a complexion considered pale or sallow, something contemporaries took note of. Novelist Paul de Kock, who saw him in 1811 on the balcony of the Tuileries, called Napoleon yellow, obese, and bloated. A British captain who met him in 1815 stated, "I felt very much disappointed, as I believe everyone else did, in his appearance. He is fat, rather what we call pot-bellied, and although his leg is well-shaped, it is rather clumsy. He is very sallow, with light grey eyes, and rather thin, greasy-looking brown hair, and altogether a very nasty, priest-like looking fellow." The stock character of Napoleon is a comically short, petty tyrant, and this has become a cliché in popular culture. He is often portrayed wearing a large bicorn hat sideways with a hand in waistcoat gesture, a reference to the painting produced in 1812 by Jacques-Louis David. In 1908 Alfred Adler, a psychologist, cited Napoleon to describe an inferiority complex in which short people adopt an over-aggressive behavior to compensate for lack of height. This inspired the term Napoleon complex. Reforms. Napoleon instituted various reforms, such as higher education, a tax code, road and sewer systems, and established the Banque de France, the first central bank in French history. He negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with the Catholic Church, which sought to reconcile the mostly Catholic population to his regime. It was presented alongside the Organic Articles, which regulated public worship in France. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire prior to German unification later in the 19th century. The sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States doubled the size of the United States. In May 1802, he instituted the Legion of Honor, a substitute for the old Royalist decorations and orders of chivalry, to encourage civilian and military achievements. The order is still the highest decoration in France. Napoleonic Code. Napoleon's set of civil laws, the Code Civil, now often known as the Napoleonic Code, was prepared by committees of legal experts under the supervision of Jean-Jacques Regis de Cambycheres, the second consul. Napoleon participated actively in the sessions of the Council of State that revised the drafts. The development of the code was a fundamental change in the nature of the civil law legal system, with its stress on clearly written and accessible law. Other codes were commissioned by Napoleon to codify criminal and commerce law. A code of criminal instruction was published, which enacted rules of due process. The Napoleonic Code was adopted throughout much of continental Europe, though only in the lands he conquered, and remained in force after Napoleon's defeat. Napoleon said, "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles. Waterloo will erase the memory of so many victories. But, what will live forever, is my civil code." The code influences a quarter of the world's jurisdictions, such as those in continental Europe, the Americas, and Africa. Dieter Langewiesche described the code as a revolutionary project that spurred the development of bourgeois society in Germany by the extension of the right to own property and an acceleration towards the end of feudalism. Napoleon reorganized what had been the Holy Roman Empire, made up of about 300 Kleinstaaterei, into a more streamlined 40-state Confederation of the Rhine. This helped promote the German Confederation and the unification of Germany in 1871. The movement toward Italian unification was similarly precipitated by Napoleonic rule. These changes contributed to the development of nationalism and the nation-state. Napoleon implemented a wide array of liberal reforms in France and across continental Europe, especially in Italy and Germany, as summarized by British historian Andrew Roberts. The ideas that underpin our modern world, meritocracy, equality before the law, property rights, religious toleration, modern secular education, sound finances, and so on, were championed, consolidated, codified and geographically extended by Napoleon. To them he added a rational and efficient local administration, an end to rural banditry, the encouragement of science and the arts, the abolition of feudalism, and the greatest codification of law since the fall of the Roman Empire. Napoleon directly overthrew remnants of feudalism in much of Western continental Europe. He liberalized property laws, ended seigneurial dues, abolished the Guild of Merchants and Craftsmen to facilitate entrepreneurship, legalized divorce, closed the Jewish ghettos and made Jews equal to everyone else. The Inquisition ended, as did the Holy Roman Empire. The power of church courts and religious authority was sharply reduced and equality under the law was proclaimed for all men. Warfare. In the field of military organization, Napoleon borrowed from previous theorists such as Jacques-Antoine Hippolyte, Comte de Guibert, and from the reforms of preceding French governments, and then developed much of what was already in place. He continued the policy, which emerged from the Revolution, of promotion based primarily on merit. Corps replaced divisions as the largest army units, mobile artillery was integrated into reserve batteries, the staff system became more fluid, and cavalry returned as an important formation in French military doctrine. These methods are now referred to as essential features of Napoleonic warfare. Though he consolidated the practice of modern conscription introduced by the Directory, one of the restored monarchy's first acts was to end it. His opponents learned from Napoleon's innovations. The increased importance of artillery after 1807 stemmed from his creation of a highly mobile artillery force, the growth in artillery numbers, and changes in artillery practices. As a result of these factors, Napoleon, rather than relying on infantry to wear away the enemy's defenses, now could use massed artillery as a spearhead to pound a break in the enemy's line that was then exploited by supporting infantry and cavalry. McConaughey rejects the alternative theory that growing reliance on artillery by the French army beginning in 1807 was an outgrowth of the declining quality of the French infantry and, later, France's inferiority in cavalry numbers. Weapons and other kinds of military technology remained static through the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, but 18th-century operational mobility underwent change. Napoleon's biggest influence was in the conduct of warfare. Antoine-Henri Jomini explained Napoleon's methods in a widely used textbook that influenced all European and American armies. Napoleon was regarded by the influential military theorist Karl von Clausewitz as a genius in the operational art of war, and historians rank him as a great military commander. Wellington, when asked who was the greatest general of the day, answered, "In this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon." Under Napoleon, a new emphasis towards the destruction, not just outmaneuvering, of enemy armies emerged. Invasions of enemy territory occurred over broader fronts, which made wars costlier and more decisive. The political effect of war increased. Defeat for a European power meant more than the loss of isolated enclaves. Near Carthaginian peaces intertwined whole national efforts, intensifying the revolutionary phenomenon of total war. Metric system. The official introduction of the metric system in September 1799 was unpopular in large sections of French society. Napoleon's rule greatly aided adoption of the new standard not only across France but also across the French sphere of influence. Napoleon took a retrograde step in 1812 when he passed legislation to introduce the Mesures usuels for retail trade, a system of measure that resembled the pre-revolutionary units but were based on the kilogram and the meter. For example, the livre metrique was 500 grams, in contrast to the value of the livre du roi, 489.5 grams. Other units of measure were rounded in a similar manner prior to the definitive introduction of the metric system across parts of Europe in the middle of the 19th century. Education. Napoleon's educational reforms laid the foundation of a modern system of education in France and throughout much of Europe. Napoleon synthesized the best academic elements from the Ancien Régime, the Enlightenment, and the Revolution, with the aim of establishing a stable, well-educated, and prosperous society. He made French the only official language. He left some primary education in the hands of religious orders, but he offered public support to secondary education. Napoleon founded a number of state secondary schools designed to produce a standardized education that was uniform across France. All students were taught the sciences along with modern and classical languages. Unlike the system during the Ancien Régime, religious topics did not dominate the curriculum, although they were present with the teachers from the clergy. Napoleon hoped to use religion to produce social stability. He gave special attention to the advanced centers, such as the École Polytechnique, that provided both military expertise and state-of-the-art research in science. Napoleon made some of the first efforts at establishing a system of secular and public education. The system featured scholarships and strict discipline, with the result being a French educational system that outperformed its European counterparts, many of which borrowed from the French system. Memory and evaluation. Criticism. In the political realm, historians debate whether Napoleon was an enlightened despot who laid the foundations of modern Europe or a megalomaniac who wrought greater misery than any man before the coming of Hitler. Many historians have concluded that he had grandiose foreign policy ambitions. The continental powers as late as 1808 were willing to give him nearly all of his gains and titles, but some scholars maintain he was overly aggressive and pushed for too much. Until his empire collapsed. He was considered a tyrant and usurper by his opponents at the time and ever since. His critics charge that he was not troubled when faced with the prospect of war and death for thousands, turned his search for undisputed rule into a series of conflicts throughout Europe and ignored treaties and conventions alike. His role in the Haitian Revolution and decision to reinstate slavery in France's overseas colonies are controversial and affect his reputation. French liberal intellectual Benjamin Constant was a staunch critic of political homogenization and personality cult that dominated Napoleonic France and wrote several books condemning Napoleon, such as The Spirit of Conquest and Usurpation and Principles of Politics Applicable to All Representative Governments. According to Constant, Bonapartism was even more tyrannical than the Bourbon monarchy, since it forced the masses to support its grand universalist narrative through imperialism and jingoism. Napoleon institutionalized plunder of conquered territories. French museums contain art stolen by Napoleon's forces from across Europe. Artifacts were brought to the Musée du Louvre for a Grand Central Museum, an example which would later be followed by others. He was compared to Adolf Hitler by the historian Peter Giel in 1947, and Claude Rib in 2005. David G. Chandler, a historian of Napoleonic warfare, wrote in 1973 that, "Nothing could be more degrading to the former and more flattering to the latter. The comparison is odious." On the whole, Napoleon was inspired by a noble dream, wholly dissimilar from Hitler's. Napoleon left great and lasting testimonies to his genius in codes of law and national identities which survive to the present day. Adolf Hitler left nothing but destruction. Critics argue Napoleon's true legacy must reflect the loss of status for France and needless deaths brought by his rule. Historian Victor Davis Hansen writes, "After all, the military record is unquestioned: 17 years of wars, perhaps 6 million Europeans dead, France bankrupt, her overseas colonies lost." Macklin states that, "He can be viewed as the man who set back European economic life for a generation by the dislocating impact of his wars." Vincent Cronin replies that such criticism relies on the flawed premise that Napoleon was responsible for the wars which bear his name, when in fact France was the victim of a series of coalitions that aimed to destroy the ideals of the revolution. British military historian Corelli Barnett calls him a social misfit who exploited France for his personal megalomaniac goals. He says Napoleon's reputation is exaggerated. French scholar Jean Tollard provided an influential account of his image as a savior. Louis Bergeron has praised the numerous changes he made to French society, especially regarding the law as well as education. His greatest failure was the Russian invasion. Many historians have blamed Napoleon's poor planning, but Russian scholars instead emphasize the Russian response, noting the notorious winter weather was just as hard on the defenders. The large and growing historiography in French, English, Russian, Spanish, and other languages has been summarized and evaluated by numerous scholars. Propaganda and memory. Napoleon's use of propaganda contributed to his rise to power, legitimated his regime, and established his image for posterity. Strict censorship, controlling various key constituents of the press, books, theater, and art were part of his propaganda scheme, aimed at portraying him as bringing desperately wanted peace and stability to France. The propagandistic rhetoric changed in relation to events and to the atmosphere of Napoleon's reign, focusing first on his role as a general in the army and identification as a soldier, and moving to his role as emperor and a civil leader. Specifically targeting his civilian audience, Napoleon fostered a relationship with the contemporary art community, taking an active role in commissioning and controlling different forms of art production to suit his propaganda goals. In England, Russia, and across Europe, though not in France, Napoleon was a popular topic of caricature. Hazarizing explores how Napoleon's image and memory are best understood. They played a key role in collective political defiance of the Bourbon Restoration monarchy in 1815–1830. People from different walks of life and areas of France, particularly Napoleonic veterans, drew on the Napoleonic legacy and its connections with the ideals of the 1789 revolution. Widespread rumors of Napoleon's return from St. Helena and Napoleon as an inspiration for patriotism, individual and collective liberties, and political mobilization manifested themselves in seditious materials, displaying the tricolor and rosettes. There were also subversive activities celebrating anniversaries of Napoleon's life and reign and disrupting royal celebrations. They demonstrated the prevailing and successful goal of the varied supporters of Napoleon to constantly destabilize the Bourbon regime. Data shows that, following the collapse of militaristic Boulangism in the late 1880s, the Napoleonic legend was divorced from party politics and revived in popular culture. Concentrating on 2 plays and 2 novels from the period: Victorine Sardou's Madame Sans Jean, Maurice Barrès's Les deux Racines, Edmond Rostand's L'Aiglon, and André Delorde and Gyp's Napoleonate. Data examines how writers and critics of the Belle Époque exploited the Napoleonic legend for diverse political and cultural ends. Reduced to a minor character, the new fictional Napoleon became not a world historical figure but an intimate one, fashioned by individuals' needs and consumed as popular entertainment. In their attempts to represent the emperor as a figure of national unity, proponents and detractors of the Third Republic used the legend as a vehicle for exploring anxieties about gender and fears about the processes of democratization that accompanied this new era of mass politics and culture. International Napoleonic congresses take place regularly, with participation by members of the French and American military, French politicians and scholars from different countries. In January 2012, the mayor of Montereau-Fault-Yonne, near Paris, the site of a late victory of Napoleon, proposed development of Napoleon's Bivouac, a commemorative theme park at a projected cost of €200 million. Long-term influence outside France. Napoleon was responsible for spreading the values of the French Revolution to other countries, especially in legal reform. After the fall of Napoleon, not only was it retained by conquered countries including the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Italy and Germany, but it has been used as the basis of certain parts of law outside Europe including the Dominican Republic, the U.S. state of Louisiana and the Canadian province of Quebec. The code was also used as a model in many parts of Latin America. The reputation of Napoleon in Poland has been favorable, especially for his support of independence, opposition to Russia, his legal code, the abolition of serfdom, and the introduction of modern middle-class administration. Napoleon had an influence on the establishment of modern Germany. He caused the end of the Holy Roman Empire and helped create middle-sized states such as Bavaria and Württemberg along the great powers Prussia and Austria. Although he also directly or indirectly helped to reduce the number of German states, the middle-sized states tried to prevent the unification of Germany as a federalist state. A byproduct of the French occupation was a strong development in German nationalism which eventually turned the German Confederation into the German Empire after a series of conflicts and other political developments. Napoleon indirectly began the process of Latin American independence when he invaded Spain in 1808. The abdication of King Charles IV and renunciation of his son, Ferdinand VII, created a power vacuum that was filled by native-born political leaders such as Simon Bolívar and José de San Martin. Such leaders embraced nationalistic sentiments influenced by French nationalism and led successful independence movements in Latin America. Napoleon also significantly aided the United States when he agreed to sell the territory of Louisiana for $15 million during the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. That territory almost doubled the size of the United States, adding the equivalent of 13 states to the Union. From 1796 to 2020, at least 95 major ships were named for him. In the 21st century, at least 18 Napoleon ships are operated under the flag of France, as well as Indonesia, Germany, Italy, Australia, Argentina, India, Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Wives, mistresses, and children. Napoleon married Josephine in 1796. When he was 26, she was a 32-year-old widow whose first husband, Alexander de Beauharnais, had been executed during the Reign of Terror. 5 days after Alexander de Beauharnais' death, the Reign of Terror initiator Maximilien de Robespierre was overthrown and executed, and, with the help of high-placed friends, Josephine was freed. Until she met Bonaparte, she had been known as Rose, a name which he disliked. He called her Josephine instead, and she went by this name henceforth. Bonaparte often sent her love letters while on his campaigns. He formally adopted her son Eugene and second cousin Stephanie and arranged dynastic marriages for them. Josephine had her daughter Hortense marry Napoleon's brother Louis. Josephine had lovers, such as Lieutenant Hippolyte Charles, during Napoleon's Italian campaign. Napoleon learned of that affair and a letter he wrote about it was intercepted by the British and published widely, to embarrass Napoleon. Napoleon had his own affairs too, During the Egyptian campaign he took Pauline Belle-Île-Fours, the wife of a junior officer, as his mistress. She became known as Cleopatra. While Napoleon's mistresses had children by him, Josephine did not produce an heir, possibly because of either the stresses of her imprisonment during the Reign of Terror or an abortion she may have had in her 20s. Napoleon chose divorce so he could remarry in search of an heir. Despite his divorce from Josephine, Napoleon showed his dedication to her for the rest of his life. When he heard the news of her death while in exile in Elba, he locked himself in his room and would not come out for 2 full days. Her name would also be his final word on his deathbed in 1821. On March 11, 1810 by proxy, he married the 19-year-old Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, and a great-niece of Marie Antoinette. Thus he had married into a German royal and imperial family. Louise was less than happy with the arrangement, at least at first, stating, "Just to see the man would be the worst form of torture." Her great-aunt had been executed in France, while Napoleon had fought numerous campaigns against Austria all throughout his military career. However, she seemed to warm up to him over time. After her wedding, she wrote to her father, "He loves me very much. I respond to his love sincerely. There is something very fetching and very eager about him that is impossible to resist." Napoleon and Marie-Louise remained married until his death, though she did not join him in exile on Elba and thereafter never saw her husband again. The couple had one child, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles, known from birth as the King of Rome. He became Napoleon II in 1814 and reigned for only 2 weeks. He was awarded the title of the Duke of Reichstadt in 1818 and died of tuberculosis aged 21, with no children. Napoleon acknowledged one illegitimate son, Charles Leon by Eleanor de Noël de la Plaine. Alexander Kolonyi-Waluski, the son of his mistress Maria Waluska, although acknowledged by Waluska's husband, was also widely known to be his child, and the DNA of his direct male descendant has been used to help confirm Napoleon's Y chromosome haplotype. He may have had further unacknowledged illegitimate offspring as well, such as Eugen Meagerly von Mühlfeld by Emily Victoria Krauss von Wolfsburg and Hélène Napoleon Bonaparte by Albine de Montholon. Notes. Citations. References. Biographical studies. None.